I want you to think about something you've never considered before. The very first yes you say each morning, before you've even left your bed, before you've spoken to another soul, before the world has made its demands upon you. That first yes is a confession. It reveals everything about who you've become and everything about who you're running from. Most people never notice this moment. They wake up and immediately say yes to the alarm clock, yes to checking their phone, yes to worry, yes to obligation, yes to everyone else's voice, but their own. And in that tiny, seemingly insignificant moment, they've already lost themselves. They've already given away their power before the day has even begun. I spent decades studying the human psyche, diving into the depths of what makes us truly ourselves versus what makes us mere shadows of other people's expectations. And I discovered something that will shake you if you let it. Your first yes of the day is not just a choice, it's a revelation of your entire psychological architecture. It's a window into your unconscious that remains open for just a few precious seconds each morning. Think about it right now. What did you say yes to this morning? Was it the urgent ping of a notification? Was it the familiar voice of anxiety telling you about everything you need to fix? Was it someone else's need, someone else's crisis, someone else's dream, or, and this is rare, so rare it's almost miraculous, did you say yes to yourself? Did you say yes to silence? Did you say yes to your own inner voice, asking what you truly want? The person who says yes to their phone first thing in the morning is telling me they believe their value comes from external validation. They're confessing that they're terrified of missing something, of being left behind, of being forgotten. They're showing me a soul that has learned to measure its worth by how quickly it responds to others. The person who says yes to worry, who lets their mind immediately spiral into all the problems waiting for them, is revealing a deep belief that they must earn their right to exist through perpetual vigilance. They've internalized a voice, usually from childhood, that told them peace is dangerous, that rest is selfish, that they must always be preparing for catastrophe. But here's what most people don't understand. These automatic yeses aren't really choices at all. They're patterns, they're ancient programs running in your unconscious, installed long ago, probably before you even had the words to question them, and they're running your entire life, from that first moment of consciousness, each day. Here's the thing most people never realize. These morning thoughts aren't random neural static. They're not just your brain warming up, like some biological engine. No, they're messages from the parts of yourself you've been ignoring, sometimes for decades. Think about it. When was the last time your first morning thought was actually about the present moment, not about yesterday's argument, not about tomorrow's deadline, not about that thing you said 5 years ago that still makes you cringe? When was it ever just now? It's almost never, and that should terrify you, because what this reveals is that you're not living in reality. You're living in a psychological echo chamber, constructed by your unconscious mind, and it's playing the same tracks on repeat, the same worries, the same resentments, the same fantasies about who you wish you were versus who you actually are. I've analyzed thousands of morning thoughts throughout my career, both my own and those of my patients, and I discovered something profound. Your morning consciousness is like a cycle. It shows you exactly where your psyche is fractured, where the energy is blocked, where the shadow is festering. Let me give you an example. I once worked with a successful businessman who woke up every single morning thinking about his father, not warm memories, not gratitude, pure, distilled anxiety about whether he'd accomplished enough, whether he'd finally earned the approval that never came when his father was alive. 43 years old, 20 years of success, and every morning without fail, his first conscious thought was, am I enough? That's not a thought. That's a wound. It's an unhealed psychological injury that his unconscious keeps probing, like your tongue keeps finding that sharp edge on a broken tooth. His conscious mind had moved on decades ago, built an empire, created a family, but his unconscious, it was still a frightened boy waiting for his father to say, well done. This is the tragedy I encountered again and again in my consulting room. Men and women who had achieved everything the world told them to value, yet they came to me hollow, anxious, unable to sleep. They didn't understand why their success felt so empty, but I understood immediately. The unconscious doesn't care about your bank account. It doesn't read your business cards or count your awards. It speaks in a different language entirely. the language of symbols, of dreams, of that gnawing feeling in your chest at 3 in the morning that something is fundamentally wrong. I remember another patient, a woman in her 40s, beautiful home, devoted husband, 2 children in excellent schools. By every measure she should have been content. Instead she sat across from me, hands trembling, describing recurring dreams of being trapped in her childhood bedroom, unable to open the door. In our work together, we discovered something profound. When she was 12, her mother told her that good girls don't make noise, don't take up space, don't demand attention. A simple statement, said perhaps without malice, but it had lodged itself deep in her unconscious, like a splinter. For 3 decades, she had been the perfect good girl. She married a man her parents approved of, though she felt no passion. She pursued a career in teaching because it seemed safe and feminine, though her true love was architecture. She raised her children with silent efficiency, never expressing her own needs or desires. Her conscious mind believed she had made wise, mature choices, but her unconscious was screaming. The dreams, the anxiety, the depression that descended on her like a fog. These were not disorders to be medicated away, they were messages. Her psyche was fighting for its life, trying desperately to tell her, this is not your life, you are living someone else's story. This is what I mean by individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who others need you to be. The tragedy is that most people never receive such a dramatic wake-up call. They simply continue, year after year, building a life that looks successful from the outside, while feeling increasingly hollow within. I've watched this pattern countless times. A man becomes a lawyer, because his father was a lawyer, then wonders at 45 why he feels such profound emptiness, despite his corner office. A woman suppresses her artistic nature to become a doctor and finds herself inexplicably drawn to galleries and museums, feeling a strange grief she cannot name. This is the shadow at work. Everything we deny, everything we push away, because it doesn't fit the persona we've constructed, doesn't simply disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, waiting, and what waits in the darkness always finds a way to speak. Let me tell you something that may disturb you. Your anxiety, your depression, your inexplicable anger, these are not signs of weakness. They are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are the psyche's way of correcting course. They are the voice of the self, trying to break through the false personality you've constructed. I had a patient once, a businessman who came to me with what he called nervous exhaustion. He described a recurring dream. He was in his office, but the walls kept closing in, and no matter how hard he pushed against them, they continued to compress. A simple dream, yes, but profoundly revealing. His conscious life was literally crushing his true nature. The dream was not a problem to be solved, it was a message to be heard. When we began exploring his childhood, we discovered something remarkable. As a boy, he had been deeply interested in music, particularly the violin. He showed genuine talent, but his father, a practical man, convinced him that music was frivolous, that real men built businesses and made money. So he buried that part of himself. He buried it so successfully that by the time he came to see me, he couldn't even remember the last time he'd listened to music for pleasure. I worked with this man for several months, and slowly, painfully, we began to excavate that buried part of his soul. At first he resisted. What does any of this have to do with my anxiety? He demanded. I'm here to fix what's wrong with me, not to waste time on childhood memories. But you see, he didn't understand yet. The anxiety wasn't something separate from him, some foreign invader that needed to be expelled. The anxiety was his psyche's way of screaming at him, of saying you've abandoned essential parts of who you are, and I will not let you rest until you acknowledge them. When we deny our authentic nature, when we live according to someone else's script, the psyche rebels. It must, because individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, is not optional. It's as necessary as breathing. You can hold your breath for a time, but eventually your body will force you to gasp for air, whether you want to or not. I asked him to do something that seemed absurd to his rational mind. I asked him to spend 15 minutes each day simply listening to music. nothing more, just listening without judgment, without purpose, without trying to extract some business insight from it. The first week he forgot every single day. The second week he remembered twice but felt nothing. The third week, something shifted. He was listening to a piece by Chopin, and without warning he began to weep. Not gentle tears, but the kind of sobbing that shakes your entire body, the kind that releases years of accumulated grief. I don't understand what's happening to me, he said in our next session, his voice still raw. I felt like I was mourning someone who had died. You were, I told him, you were mourning the person you might have been. The musician, the artist, the dreamer. You've been carrying his corpse inside you for 30 years. And here's what he taught me, that changed everything. Asterisk. You cannot befriend your shadow without first acknowledging it exists. Asterisk. Most people spend their entire lives pretending they're only one thing: the good parent, the responsible employee, the rational thinker. They've built an identity like a fortress wall, and on the other side of that wall lives everything they've disowned about themselves: their rage, their selfishness, their weakness, their wild, irrational desires. I remember a woman who came to see me, a devout churchgoer, who kept having violent fantasies about hurting people who cut in front of her in line. She was terrified of herself. She thought she was going insane. I'm a Christian, she told me, trembling. These thoughts, they can't be mine. But of course they were hers. The shadow doesn't come from outside. It comes from within, from all the parts of ourselves we've been taught are unacceptable. I asked her, when in your life were you taught that anger was unforgivable? She started to cry. My mother used to say that anger was the devil's emotion, that good girls never got angry. So for 40 years, every time she felt anger, she pushed it down into the basement of her psyche. And what happens when you lock something in a basement for 40 years? It doesn't disappear. It grows stronger. It festers. It waits. The shadow is patient. It can wait decades. And eventually, it will find a way to express itself, whether you're conscious of it or not, through your inexplicable irritability, through passive-aggressive comments, through sudden explosions that seem to come from nowhere, or if you're particularly good at repression, through your body, headaches, tension, illness. The body keeps the score when the mind refuses to count. This is why integration is not optional, it's inevitable. The only question is whether you'll do it consciously or whether your shadow will do it for you. And let me tell you something about this inevitability. The shadow doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't check your calendar or ask if now is a convenient time for a reckoning. It moves according to its own timeline, and that timeline is always asterisk, now asterisk. I've watched people spend decades building elaborate lives, careers, marriages, reputations, all while stuffing their shadows into smaller and smaller boxes. They think they're winning. They point to their achievements as proof that they've transcended their darkness. But the shadow isn't transcended, it's compressed. And what's compressed eventually explodes. You want to know what happens when integration happens unconsciously? Let me paint you the picture. The successful executive who suddenly can't get out of bed. The devoted parent who abandons their family for a stranger they met online. The spiritual teacher caught in scandal. The politician undone by the very vice they campaigned against. These aren't moral failures. They're shadow eruptions. The unconscious finally breaking through the walls of denial. This is what I mean when I say the shadow will integrate you. If you don't integrate it, it will choose the moment. It will choose the method. And I promise you, its choices will be far more dramatic than anything you would consciously orchestrate. I worked with a man once, a prominent judge, known for his harsh sentencing and rigid moral code. He came to me not for therapy, but because he was having what he called episodes, blackouts where he'd lose time. He'd find himself in parts of the city he never visited, with no memory of how he got there. His shadow wasn't just knocking anymore. It was hijacking his consciousness entirely. Through our work, we discovered what he'd buried, a wild, creative, sensual part of himself that he'd murdered in adolescence to please a tyrannical father. Every criminal he sentenced, he was sentencing that part of himself. Every harsh judgment was a hammer blow against his own imprisoned vitality. His psyche finally said, "Enough, if you won't give this part of you a voice, I'll take over complete. This is the mercy of the psyche. It will not let you die half alive. It would rather destroy your carefully constructed identity than let you continue murdering your wholeness. You see, the shadow doesn't want to ruin your life, it wants to save it, but you've misunderstood its language for so long that you interpret every whisper as a threat, every impulse as sabotage. Let me tell you what happens when a person finally stops running. I once worked with a minister, a man of impeccable reputation. He came to me because he kept having dreams of wandering through brothels, not with guilt, but with curiosity. His conscious mind was horrified, but his shadow was trying to show him something he desperately needed to see, that his spirituality had become so sanitized, so sterile, that he'd lost contact with the raw, messy, embodied reality of being human. He thought the dreams meant he was secretly depraved. I told him they meant he was secretly alive. When he finally allowed himself to acknowledge the earthy, sensual, even crude aspects of his nature, not by acting them out destructively, but by giving them space in his inner world, his preaching transformed. It became magnetic. People wept in his sermons because for the first time, he was speaking not from the castle of righteousness, but from the battlefield of being human. This is what integration looks like. Not perfection, not purity, but wholeness. The shadow carries your vitality, your instincts, your creativity, your power, all the qualities you buried because someone told you they were unacceptable. And here's the cruel irony. The very things you push into the shadow become the demons that chase you. The anger you won't own becomes the rage that explodes at your children. The ambition you deny becomes the envy that poisons your friendships. The sexuality you suppress becomes the shame that destroys your intimacy. You cannot kill these parts of yourself. You can only choose whether they serve you or sabotage you. And the world needs your shadow integrated. It needs your holy anger at injustice, not your polite silence. It needs your fierce ambition channeled into creation, not rotting into resentment. It needs your full humanity, not your carefully edited highlight reel. Because a person who has faced their shadow becomes dangerous in the most beautiful way. They cannot be manipulated by shame. They cannot be controlled by fear of exposure. They've already seen the worst in themselves and chosen wholeness anyway. They've stopped negotiating with their own humanity. And this, perhaps above all else, is what makes them dangerous to systems built on self-rejection. Our culture thrives on creating a civil war within you. Advertising, religion, education, each one profits from the gap between who you are and who you should be. The diet industry needs you to hate your body. The self-help industrial complex needs you to feel broken. Political movements need you to fear the parts of yourself you see reflected in the enemy. But the individuated person has called a truce with themselves. They no longer fund the war effort. They've withdrawn their energy from the conflict between their light and their darkness, their strength and their weakness, their desires and their duties. Not because they've become some enlightened being without contradictions, but because they've realized the fight itself was the trap. I see this especially in how they handle moral complexity. The non-individuated person needs villains. They need clear categories, good people and bad people, right and wrong, us and them. It's a child's morality, a desperate attempt to keep the world simple enough to navigate without having to feel the full weight of human ambiguity. But the individuated person has developed what I call moral gravity. They can hold the weight of paradox without collapsing into relativism. They can say this is wrong, while understanding how someone arrived there. They can condemn an action while recognizing that same capacity within themselves. This isn't weakness, it's the opposite. It takes far more strength to maintain moral clarity while acknowledging complexity than it does to maintain moral certainty through ignorance. The person who can say, I am capable of such darkness, which is precisely why I choose otherwise, carries a conviction that the merely righteous never achieve. And they extend this same nuanced vision to everyone around them. They don't need you to be perfect to love you. They don't need you to be broken to help you. They see you as you are, flawed, striving, contradictory. and they meet you there with the same compassion they've extended to themselves. This is what true emotional maturity looks like in relationship. Not the cold detachment that some mistake for wisdom, not the endless patience that enables dysfunction, but a warm, clear-eyed presence that says, I see your humanity and I'm not afraid of it. I've watched these individuals navigate conflicts that would shatter less integrated personalities. A betrayal by a friend, a professional setback that undermines years of work, a family member's addiction spiraling into crisis. And what strikes me most is not that they don't feel pain, they absolutely do, but that they don't let that pain turn them into someone they're not. They don't suddenly become cruel because they've been hurt. They don't abandon their values because maintaining them has become inconvenient. They bend, yes, they feel the weight of what's happening, but they don't break into fragments, with each fragment reacting from a different wound, a different age, a different unresolved trauma. There's a woman I knew who discovered her business partner had been embezzling funds for over a year. The betrayal was profound, not just financial but personal. They'd built something together, or so she thought. The easy path would have been pure rage, scorched earth, legal warfare fueled by vindictiveness. And she did feel rage. She told me about it, how it moved through her body like electricity, how she had to sit with it for days before she could think clearly. But when she finally acted, she acted from her whole self, not just from her wound. She pursued accountability. Yes, legal consequences, restitution, protection of what remained. But she did it without the theatrical cruelty that trauma often demands, without the need to humiliate, to destroy beyond what justice required. She could hold both truths. This person had wronged her deeply, and this person was also someone struggling with demons she couldn't see. That's the paradox of deep healing. It doesn't make you soft, it makes you strong enough to be soft when that serves you, strong enough to be hard when that's required. It gives you choice where before you only had reaction. Think of it this way, the shadow isn't something you defeat. It's not a dragon you slay once and mount on your wall. It's more like gravity. It's always there. The question is whether you learn to work with it or spend your whole life being pulled down by a force you refuse to acknowledge. I've watched people try to kill their shadow for decades. They meditate it away. They affirm it into submission. They bury it under positive thinking and vision boards. And you know what happens? It gets stronger in the dark. It feeds on neglect. And one day it erupts in ways that shock everyone, including the person it's erupting from. The news is full of these stories. The spiritual teacher caught in a scandal. The motivational speaker exposed for cruelty behind closed doors. The wellness influencer unraveling in public meltdowns. We act surprised every time, but I'm never surprised, because I know what happens when someone builds an identity entirely on light while treating their darkness like a dirty secret. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to be seen, to be acknowledged, to finally have a seat at the table of your consciousness. And when you give it that, when you stop treating it like an enemy and start treating it like information, something remarkable happens. You stop leaking. That's the only way I can describe it. You know what I mean if you've ever been around someone who seems perfectly pleasant on the surface, but there's just something off. A passive-aggressive comment here, a weird energy there, a sense that beneath the smile, something is boiling. That's shadow leakage. That's what happens when the repressed contents of the psyche find cracks to seep through. But when you integrate, when you own your whole story, you become solid, coherent. What you see is what you get. There's no hidden agenda, because you've already looked at your agendas and decided which ones serve you and which ones don't. There's no secret rage, because you've acknowledged your anger and learned to channel it constructively. People feel this. They might not be able to name it, but they feel it. They trust you more. They relax around you, because on some instinctive level, they sense that you're not hiding a monster in the basement of your personality. But let me be clear about something. Integrating your shadow doesn't make you morally superior. It doesn't grant you some kind of enlightened status where you float above the messy problems of human existence. In fact, it often does the opposite. When you truly acknowledge your shadow, you become more humble. because you realize, genuinely realize, that you're capable of the same petty cruelties, the same selfishness, the same destructive impulses as anyone else. The sanctimonious certainty evaporates. You stop dividing the world into good people and bad people, because you understand that those categories are childish oversimplifications. I've watched this transformation happen countless times. The person who comes to me absolutely convinced of their moral purity, who can recite their virtues like a shopping list, that person is dangerous. Not because they're evil, but because they're unconscious. They don't know what they're capable of. They haven't mapped the darker territories of their own psyche. But the person who says, yes, I've felt hatred, yes, I've wanted revenge, yes, there's a part of me that's capable of terrible things, that person I can trust. Not because they're likely to act on those impulses, but precisely because they're not. Consciousness is the great transformer. When you see something clearly, you gain power over it. Think of it this way: an unintegrated shadow is like a wild animal pacing in a cage. It's unpredictable, dangerous, completely at the mercy of its instincts. But when you integrate that shadow, you don't kill the animal, you don't even tame it in the conventional sense. Instead, you develop a relationship with it. You learn its patterns, its needs, its nature. You stop being afraid of it, and in doing so, you stop giving it unconscious control over your life. This is why shadow work is fundamentally different from simple self-improvement. Self-improvement often means rejecting parts of yourself, trying to become someone else, someone better. Shadow integration means becoming more completely yourself, including the parts you'd rather not acknowledge. But how do you actually do this work? How do you face what you've spent a lifetime avoiding? The first step is recognition, and this is harder than it sounds. Your shadow doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on the door and introduce itself politely. It shows up in disguise, in all the places you'd least expect to find yourself. You find it in your reactions. When someone does something that fills you with disproportionate rage or disgust, that's worth examining. Why does this particular behavior bother you so much? Often, it's because you're seeing your own disowned qualities reflected back at you. The person you can't stand, who talks too much and always needs attention, they might be showing you the gregarious, attention-seeking part of yourself that you learned to suppress because you were taught that being quiet and humble was virtuous. You find it in your patterns. The same conflicts repeating in different relationships. The same self-sabotage appearing at the threshold of success. The same inexplicable anxiety when faced with certain situations. These aren't random occurrences, they're your shadow asserting itself, trying to be seen. You find it in your projections. Everything you believe about other people, especially the strong beliefs, the things you're absolutely certain about, contain information about your inner world. The colleague you're convinced is judging you harshly might be reflecting your own harsh self-judgment. The friend you believe is always disappointed in you might be showing you your disappointment in yourself. Active imagination is one of the most powerful tools I developed for this work. You dialogue with the shadow, you give it a voice, let it speak to you. Not literally, not as though you're losing your mind, but through writing, through art, through allowing the thoughts you normally censor to emerge. Ask yourself, what would the part of me I'm most ashamed of say if it could speak freely? Perhaps you discover that it's angry, not at the world, but at you, for ignoring it, for pretending it doesn't exist. Perhaps it's afraid, perhaps it simply wants to be acknowledged. This is not indulgence, this is not giving yourself permission to become your worst impulses. It's the opposite. When you bring the shadow into the light, you rob it of its compulsive power. The man who admits he is capable of cruelty becomes less likely to be cruel, because he's no longer defending against the truth. He's integrated it. The woman who acknowledges her capacity for selfishness can finally act generously, because she's no longer compensating out of guilt. You see, the shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be part of you. And when you refuse it, when you exile it to the basement of your psyche, it doesn't disappear. It gathers strength. It waits. And one day when you're tired, when your defenses are down, it emerges in ways you can't control. This is why good people do terrible things. Not because they're secretly evil, but because they've spent so long insisting they're only good that the shadow, when it finally breaks through, does so with volcanic force. I've seen it countless times. the devoted father who suddenly abandons his family, the righteous activist who becomes the very tyrant she opposed, the compassionate healer who turns manipulative and cruel. Each believed themselves incapable of such actions. Each had built an identity that excluded the darker possibilities, and each paid the price. But integration, true integration, offers another way. When you acknowledge the beast within, you can choose not to feed it. When you admit your capacity for destruction, you gain the power to create instead. The energy doesn't disappear, it transforms. Think of it this way: the same fire that burns down a house can forge steel. The same force that drives violence can fuel courage. The same capacity for hatred can become fierce protection of what you love. It's not about eliminating the energy. It's about directing it consciously rather than being ambushed by it. This is what I mean by wholeness. Not perfection, wholeness. The integration of all that you are, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, acceptable and forbidden. And here's the paradox that most never grasp: you cannot integrate what you refuse to see. You cannot heal what you pretend doesn't exist. The shadow doesn't vanish because you ignore it. It simply operates outside your awareness, pulling strings you didn't know were attached to you. I've watched people spend decades building elaborate personas, carefully curated identities that say, "This is who I am." Meanwhile, their actual behavior, their patterns, their relationships, their recurring crises tells an entirely different story. The persona says, "I'm confident." The pattern says, "I constantly need validation." The persona says, "I'm independent." The shadow says, "I'm terrified of abandonment." Which one is true? Both, neither. That's the point. You're not one thing, you're a constellation of opposing forces, and pretending otherwise doesn't make you whole, it makes you fragmented. Think of the man who prides himself on rationality, who mocks emotion as weakness, who builds his entire identity around being logical. What happens to all those feelings he refuses to acknowledge? They don't disappear. They accumulate in the shadow, growing stronger in the darkness. And one day, seemingly out of nowhere, he explodes in irrational rage over something trivial, or he falls into inexplicable depression, or he becomes obsessed with someone who represents everything his conscious mind claims to reject. This is shadow possession. When you refuse the shadow a seat at the table, it doesn't leave, it waits until you're vulnerable, then it takes over the whole house. I've seen this pattern so many times it ceased to surprise me. The devoted family man caught in a sordid affair, the peaceful activist who becomes violently aggressive, the spiritual teacher exposed for manipulation and abuse. These aren't anomalies. They're predictable outcomes of shadow denial. The greater the persona, the darker the shadow. The more you insist you're only light, the more powerful your darkness becomes. It's a law as reliable as gravity. So what's the alternative? Not to become your shadow. That's just trading one imbalance for another. The work is integration, acknowledgement, consciousness. You begin by admitting a simple truth. I contain multitudes. I am capable of things I find disturbing. I have impulses I don't act on, thoughts I don't speak, feelings I don't want to own. And as you sit with that admission, as you let it settle in your chest, uncomfortable as it is, something remarkable begins to happen. The grip loosens. Not because the shadow has disappeared, but because you've stopped pretending it isn't there. This is the paradox that most people never understand. Acknowledgement is not endorsement. To see your capacity for cruelty does not make you cruel. To recognize your selfishness does not make you a selfish person. To feel attraction you judge as inappropriate does not make you immoral. What it makes you is human, conscious, aware of the full spectrum of what exists within you. I remember a patient who came to me in tremendous distress. He was a devoted father, a good man by any measure. But he'd begun having intrusive thoughts, violent images involving his own children. He was convinced he was a monster, that something evil had infected him. He couldn't sleep. He was afraid to be alone with his kids. I asked him a question that seemed to shock him. "Have you ever acted on these thoughts?" "Of course not," he said, horrified. "Do you want to act on them?" "Never. The thought sickens me." "Then what you're experiencing," I told him, "is not who you are. It's a signal from your unconscious. Your psyche is showing you something about power, about control, about the vulnerability you feel as a parent in a world you cannot protect them from completely. The thoughts weren't desires, they were fears dressed in terrible images. His shadow wasn't his violence, it was his terror of his own powerlessness. When he understood this, when he stopped fighting the thoughts and started asking what they were trying to communicate, they lost their grip. Within weeks, they had faded almost entirely. This is what integration looks like. You stop being at war with yourself. You stop dividing your experience into acceptable and unacceptable and instead become curious about all of it. You start asking, what is this showing me? What am I afraid of? What part of me needs attention, needs expression, needs to be understood rather than banished? And slowly, not overnight, but gradually, you begin to feel more whole. The energy you were using to suppress and hide becomes available for living, for creating, for connecting authentically with others. Because here's what I learned in all my years of work with the human soul: the people who seem most integrated, most genuine, most fully alive, they're not the ones who've eliminated their darkness. They're the ones who've made peace with it. They're the ones who can sit with a friend in despair without rushing to fix them, because they've sat in their own despair. They're the ones who can listen to confessions without judgment, because they know their own transgressions. They're the ones who can hold space for complexity, contradiction, ambiguity, because they've stopped demanding that life be simple or fair or comfortable. This is the paradox I want you to understand. The more you accept your darkness, the lighter you become. Not light in the sense of superficial happiness, but light in the sense of being unburdened. When you stop carrying the exhausting weight of pretending, of performing, of maintaining an impossible image of perfection, when you set that burden down, you discover a freedom you didn't know was possible. I think of a patient I worked with, a woman who came to me consumed by shame over what she called her terrible thoughts. She was a devoted mother, and yet sometimes she had flashes of resentment toward her children. Sometimes she fantasized about running away. Sometimes she wished, just for a moment, that she'd never had them at all. She was convinced she was a monster. These thoughts, she believed, revealed something fundamentally broken in her. No good mother would think such things. But here's what I helped her see. Every mother has these thoughts, every single one. The difference is that most won't admit it, even to themselves. They push these thoughts down so deep, they can barely glimpse them, and in doing so they become disconnected from their authentic emotional experience. When this woman finally accepted these thoughts, not acted on them, not indulged them, but simply acknowledged them as part of the full spectrum of her inner life, something remarkable happened. The thoughts lost their power. They became just thoughts, passing clouds in the sky of her consciousness, and paradoxically, she became a better mother, more patient, more present, more real, because she wasn't spending all her energy policing her inner world anymore. She could actually be with her children, fully and authentically, rather than performing an idea of motherhood while secretly terrified of her own humanity. This is what integration looks like in practice. It's messy, it's humbling, it requires tremendous courage, not the courage of a warrior charging into battle, but the courage of someone willing to sit still and face what arises within. But here's what happens when you do this work. You begin to experience something extraordinary. You start to feel more whole, more integrated. You notice that the world no longer triggers you in the same ways. The person who once infuriated you now seems almost transparent. You see their own shadows, their own wounds, and instead of rage, you feel something closer to compassion. This doesn't mean you become passive. It doesn't mean you allow yourself to be mistreated, or that you abandon your boundaries. Quite the opposite. When you're no longer fighting your own inner demons through external conflicts, you become far clearer about what actually matters. You can say no with firmness, and without hatred. You can walk away from what doesn't serve you without burning everything down in the You see, projection isn't just a problem, it's also a pathway. Every projection, when properly understood, is a breadcrumb leading you back home to yourself. Each strong reaction is a teacher pointing towards some aspect of your psyche that needs attention, integration, or healing. I spent years analyzing dreams, and I can tell you the psyche is always trying to balance itself. It's always reaching toward wholeness. When you push something down in the basement of your consciousness, it doesn't disappear, it simply waits, and eventually it will knock on the door. It will appear in your relationships, in your recurring conflicts, in your inexplicable anxieties. The people who trigger you most intensely are often the ones carrying the heaviest projections. That colleague who seems arrogant, perhaps they're carrying your disowned confidence. That friend who appears needy, maybe they're holding your rejected vulnerability. That public figure you despise with surprising intensity. Look closely. What quality in them repels you so viscerally that it demands examination? And here's the paradox. The moment you reclaim these projections, the moment you acknowledge this is also in me, those external figures often lose their power over you. They become ordinary again, human, flawed, yes, but no longer monstrous or godlike. And something shifts in your relationship with yourself. You realize that for years, you've been doing the same thing to yourself that you did to your parents. You've been projecting the parent archetype onto yourself, becoming your own harsh judge, your own impossible standard, your own internalized critic. That voice in your head that says you're never good enough. That's not wisdom. It's the ghost of the archetypal parent you created in childhood, now turned inward. When you make a mistake and that voice says, you should have known better, or you always mess things up, that's the projection speaking. It's the internalized perfect parent judging you against an impossible standard. But here's what happens when you withdraw this projection too. You start treating yourself with the same humanity you've learned to extend to your parents. You begin to see your own limitations, not as failures, but as the natural boundaries of being human. Your mistakes become data, not evidence of your unworthiness. Your needs stop being shameful and become simply needs. I remember a patient, a brilliant academic, who could extend infinite compassion to her students, but none to herself. She would stay up until 3 in the morning, revising a paper, berating herself for every imperfect sentence. One day she said to me, I realized I would never speak to my daughter the way I speak to myself. And I asked, then why do you speak to yourself that way? She had no answer, because there is no answer. The internal tyrant we create is not there to protect us or improve us. It's simply the shadow of an archetypal projection that was never real to begin with. When you withdraw that projection, when you stop demanding that you be the perfect parent to yourself, you discover something radical. You can make mistakes and still be worthy. You can have limits and still have value. You can be imperfect and still deserve love. This is not self-indulgence. It's not lowering your standards or giving up on growth. It's recognizing that real growth doesn't come from being beaten into submission by an internalized tyrant. It comes from being met with the same patient curiosity you'd extend to someone you genuinely want to understand. And here's what begins to shift when you offer yourself that kind of curiosity instead of criticism. You stop performing your life and start living it. Because so much of what we call discipline is actually performance anxiety in disguise. You're not actually trying to become healthier or more productive. You're trying to prove to some invisible audience, maybe your parents, maybe your peers, maybe just that internalized judge, that you're worthy of taking up space. And that, more than anything, is what keeps you trapped. Because you can't win a game designed around proving your worth. There's no finish line. No amount of achievement that finally grants you permission to rest, to be flawed, to be human. I see this constantly in the people who come to me exhausted by their own ambition. They've accomplished extraordinary things, by any reasonable measure, but they feel hollow, because none of it was done from a place of genuine desire or curiosity. It was all done to silence the voice that said they weren't enough. So they're left with achievements that feel like someone else's trophies. A life that looks impressive from the outside, but feels like a life sentence from within. And the cruel irony, the version of yourself you've been trying to become through all this self-punishment already exists. It's just buried under layers of shame and performance. The person who actually takes care of their body does so because they're curious about how good they can feel, not because they hate how they look. The person who does meaningful work does so because they're genuinely interested in the problems they're solving, not because they're terrified of being seen as lazy. The difference isn't semantic, it's the difference between sustainable action and eventual collapse. When you move from self-criticism, you're always running on borrowed time. You can maintain it for a while through sheer force of will, but eventually the body keeps the score. The psyche demands its due, and you break down, burn out, or simply stop caring altogether. But when you move from self-understanding, from genuine curiosity about who you are and what you actually need, the energy is renewable, because you're not fighting yourself anymore. You're working with the full complexity of your nature, not against it. This doesn't mean you never feel resistance or discomfort, but there's a fundamental difference between the discomfort of growth and the pain of self-violation. When you violate yourself, there's a quality of wrongness that permeates everything. Your body knows it before your mind does. There's a tightness in your chest, a heaviness in your movements, a flatness in your voice when you speak about what you're doing. Your sleep becomes disturbed, not because you're excited about tomorrow, but because some part of you is trying to wake you up from a life you're sleepwalking through. The discomfort of growth feels entirely different. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, there's fear and uncertainty. But underneath it all, there's a sense of rightness, of alignment, of moving towards something rather than away from yourself. You feel more alive, not less. More present, not more dissociated. The anxiety that comes with growth carries possibility within it. The anxiety that comes from self-betrayal carries only dread. I've watched people transform when they finally stop abandoning themselves for the approval of others. It's not that they become selfish or uncaring. Quite the opposite, they become more genuinely generous because their generosity comes from fullness rather than depletion. They become more present in their relationships because they're no longer using those relationships to escape from themselves. Your integrity isn't something you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It's something you practice, sometimes moment by moment. It's the choice to speak truthfully when a lie would be more convenient. It's the decision to honor your need for rest when productivity culture screams at you to keep pushing. It's the willingness to disappoint someone else rather than betray yourself. And here's what nobody tells you about this path. It gets easier. Not because the challenges disappear, but because you develop a kind of inner compass that guides you. You start to recognize the feeling of alignment versus the feeling of self-abandonment. You become more skilled at navigating the tension between your needs and the needs of others. You build a relationship with yourself that's sturdy enough to weather the storms of life. And perhaps most importantly, you learn that healing isn't about erasing what happened to you. It's about changing your relationship to it. The wound doesn't disappear, the memory doesn't vanish, but the power it holds over you begins to shift. What once controlled you becomes something you carry with awareness. What once defined you becomes part of your story, but not the whole story. I've watched this transformation countless times. The woman who was sexually abused as a child doesn't forget what happened, but she stops living as though it's still happening. She stops bracing for the next violation. She begins to trust her body again, slowly, carefully. She learns to say yes to pleasure without shame, to say no to touch without guilt. The man abandoned by his father doesn't erase the absence, but he stops searching for his father in every relationship. He stops performing for approval. He begins to show up as himself, flawed and whole, and discovers that he's enough, not because someone finally validated him, but because he validated himself. This is the paradox of healing. You don't heal by becoming someone new. You heal by becoming more fully yourself, the self that was always there beneath the survival strategies, beneath the defensive patterns, beneath the roles you played to stay safe. You peel back the layers of adaptation and discover the original person underneath. Not innocent, not untouched, but authentic. Scarred yes, but no longer defined by the scars. Wounded certainly, but no longer organizing your entire life around the wound. And as you do this work, this slow, unglamorous, often frustrating work of integration, something unexpected happens. You stop looking for permission to exist. You stop waiting for someone to tell you that you're allowed to take up space, to have needs, to want things, to feel what you feel. You claim your right to be here, exactly as you are, without apology and without shame. Not loudly, not with fanfare, just quietly, steadily, one small choice at a time. You choose yourself when it would be easier not to. You speak your truth when silence would be safer. You honor your boundaries when pleasing others would be more comfortable. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the center of gravity in your life shifts. You stop living at the mercy of your past. You start living from the authority of your present. You begin to see that healing is not about becoming who you once were before the trauma. That person is gone, and trying to resurrect them is like trying to rewind a river. It cannot be done. Instead, healing is about becoming who you are capable of being because of what you've endured. It's about integration, not erasure. The scar remains, but it no longer dictates the shape of your life. I've watched people make this shift. A woman who survived years of emotional abuse begins to speak her truth without apology. A man who lost everything in a moment of violence discovers he can build again, not from neovation, but from hard-won wisdom. A young person who grew up in chaos learns to create the stability they never received. These are not stories of triumph over trauma, they are stories of transformation through trauma, and that distinction matters immensely. Because when you stop trying to defeat your past and start learning from it, you access something profound. You access the part of you that has always been whole, even when you felt shattered. The part that observed your suffering without being destroyed by it. The part that kept you breathing through the unbearable nights. This is what I call the self, the organizing center of the psyche that transcends ego. It is not created by trauma, but it is often revealed through it. When everything falls away, what remains is essential. And here is the paradox that I return to again and again. The wound that nearly destroyed you becomes the very thing that initiates you into a deeper life. Not because suffering is noble, not because pain is necessary, but because consciousness is necessary. And sometimes, only suffering breaks us open enough to let the light in. You carry both now, the wound and the wisdom, the memory and the meaning. And you have the choice, every single day, of which one you will feed. The past will always whisper, but you no longer have to obey. You are not what happened to you, you are what you choose to become in spite of it, and because of it. And that choice, renewed each morning, is the most sacred act of defiance there is.